Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 deals with managing interpersonal conflict, so let's get started. There are many things that contribute to a conflict. One of these is a perception of struggle or an expressed struggle. Usually this is between two or more people, and oftentimes the struggle may be based on ideas or attitudes or behaviors and how people expect to behave or want to behave. And this is where people tend to run into struggles about what the appropriate course of action should be. A lot of time, there is also a perception that there are incompatible goals with regards to conflict. So perhaps you are in a conflict with someone right now even, where you want something in the relationship and the other person is unable to deliver it or unable to provide that. Or maybe you have a goal in the relationship that you would like to achieve, and maybe the other person doesn't find that goal to be very important or very worthy. So those would be examples of incompatible goals. Another issue that contributes to conflict is a perception of resource scarcity or scarce resources. So resources can take the form of monetary or financial resources. Maybe we just don't think we have enough money to manage a situation or handle a situation. Maybe there is a perception of resource shortage with regards to time, right? Maybe you just don't think there's enough time to do what it is that somebody else wants you to do. There may also be a perception of resource shortage with regards to emotions or emotional commitment. So sometimes in relationships, one person is perhaps more emotionally committed than the other person, and that obviously will play out in the way in which people deal with each other and relate to each other. So a lot of times this perception of incompatible goals and scarce resources contributes to an expressed struggle between two or more parties. In addition, in order for a conflict to even exist, there does have to be a relative level of interdependence between two or more people. When we talk about interdependence, we mean that basically there is a relationship that has existed in the past and will probably continue to exist in the future. And because of that mutual interdependence, there is a sense of relying or needing to rely on another person in order to achieve your goals. So we can see how this could contribute to conflict in situations, especially where one person has a need in the relationship perhaps that they need their relational partner to meet. So let's say in a romantic relationship or a marriage. And if the other person is either unable to meet that need or unwilling to meet that need, then this issue of interdependence can make it difficult, because if you are emotionally interdependent with people, which most relationships have a level of interdependence, then you do need the person on some level in order to achieve relational goals, or even in order just to have a fairly functional day-to-day life, right? So if you are in a long-term partnership with someone, romantic partnership, and let's say you live together and you're running the household, in order to effectively run a household, you have to have people who are able to depend on each other. There has to be an element of predictability and stability there. People need to follow through on the different types of tasks or social or relational issues that need to be addressed, right? And so these kinds of things create interdependence, and sometimes that interdependence can contribute to conflict because perhaps one person maybe isn't holding up their end of the deal. And if that happens, then the other person obviously is going to be at a disadvantage in terms of getting the needs of the household met, and that can be challenging, right? So these are all things that tend to contribute to conflict. And finally, one other thing is a perception of interference from another. So using my example in the previous item here on interdependence, if you are in a long-term living relationship with someone, it could be a roommate or a romantic partner or even a family member, because of the fact that there is interdependence, right? And we have these different goals that we have to achieve on a day-to-day and a weekly, monthly, annual basis with regards to effectively running a household. When somebody does not follow through, let's say on their end of the bargain or on their end of the responsibility, then that is a type of interference that can break down the way that the family system or the relationship runs. So this perception of interference from another is one of the elements that defines a conflict. So just to recap, conflict defined includes a struggle between two or more people. There's usually a perception of incompatible goals. There's also usually a perception of resource scarcity. There is an assumed level of interdependence in the relationship, and there is also a perception of interference in meeting the needs or goals that someone has from someone in that relationship, which contributes to the conflict. Now, we hear the term constructive conflict quite a bit, don't we? And it's a term that tends to get thrown around a lot. You want to use constructive conflict, you want to avoid destructive conflict, but what actually constitutes constructive conflict? Well, let's get into some of these things. Constructive conflict is defined, first of all, by good communication skills. People are able to clearly identify what their thoughts, feelings, and needs in the relationship are. They are able to convey those thoughts, feelings, and needs in a way that is socially responsible, which basically means there's an absence of abusive or hostile communication, right? So they do not use hostile communication when they are dealing with conflict. They are able to maintain a level of emotional calmness during the conflict, and if they do not feel calm, they take a time out in order to achieve emotional calmness before they engage in more discussion about the conflict. The reason it's important to take a timeout is basically a pre-agreed upon length of time that you can come up with someone in a relationship, either family or a friend or romantic partner, where you say that if either one of us in this relationship gets upset, then we are going to take a timeout, and we're doing the timeout so that we can both get back to a level of feeling calm, so that when we talk about the issue, we are processing our thoughts and feelings and strategies in a rational way. The reason that the timeout is so important in terms of constructive conflict, and by the way, taking a timeout is probably one of the most important things to do with constructive conflict, according to the leading research and psychologists who counsel people about these kinds of issues. The reason it's so important is because as soon as we get upset or sad, angry, sad, frustrated, or anything like that, basically the region of our brain called the amygdala, gets activated. And the amygdala region of the brain is basically the region of the brain that activates the fight or flight response in human beings. So as soon as you get upset, the amygdala region of your brain is becoming activated. And what that means is that all of the blood and energy and resources in your body is basically now going to the rest of your body through the form of adrenaline, and it is not going into your brain anymore, because the amygdala, once it becomes activated, basically sends a survival message to your body that says that you need to try to stay alive in this situation, And so what that does is that, of course, floods your system with cortisol, it floods your system with adrenaline, and when that's happening, it is very difficult for human beings to think about things rationally and to come up with rational responses, especially during conflict. This is why it is so important, in order to be a good communicator, to take a time out when one or both or anyone in the conflict becomes upset. Another major theme in constructive conflict is that they help us actually to work through the issues. The conflict helps us to work through issues rather than causing the relationship to deteriorate. So if you have destructive conflict, what you have is you have a situation where people, rather than working through issues when they have communication about conflict, they actually end up breaking the relationship down because of the negative conflict strategies that they use. So effective conflict or constructive conflict will actually help us work through the issues rather than damaging the relationship. Another element of constructive conflict is that if the conflict is handled effectively, it can actually strengthen and deepen the relationship, because you end up going through a situation with people where you learn more about each other, you understand people better, you get to see people in a more vulnerable place, and so you're able to become closer in the relationship. And constructive conflict can also enhance the level of commitment that people have in the relationship because they have gone through things together. When conflict is destructive, however, people tend to neglect the relationship. They tend to want to quit the conversation and not complete the conversation. And generally speaking, destructive conflict does not help the relationship, and in fact, it tends to break down the relationship. And this is why all of us want to work to cultivate good communication skills and effective conflict management skills in our relationships so that we can preserve the good relationships that we have, and so that in the future we can build positive, healthy relationships with people that we might meet. There are several different approaches to managing conflict, and we're going to go through each of these one by one. One of the conflict approaches is the avoiding conflict. This is seen as a lose-lose situation because there is really no way to resolve the conflict. So an example of this would be a situation, let's say, where Sam and Chris are roommates or they're good friends, and maybe there's been an issue that has come up with regards to what they spend their leisure time doing together, or maybe there's been an issue with regards to, somebody borrowed someone's car and, something like that. So an avoiding perspective would be a situation where Sam and Chris just stop hanging out rather than dealing with the conflict. Another way that people avoid conflict is, rather than ending the relationship, is they just refuse to admit that there's anything wrong and they stay in the relationship. Now, as you can imagine, when you have people that refuse to admit that there's a problem, but they're continuing to have a relationship with you, that can be problematic on several levels, right? When people avoid conflict, they may have resentments that are stuffed or unexpressed, and that can contribute to a negative communication climate. So there are many reasons why we do not want to avoid conflict, but rather we want to seek to face conflict with open communication skills, honesty, and a genuine desire to resolve the issues rather than stuff them under the carpet or try to dominate by imposing our will upon others regardless of what the other person's needs are. A second type of conflict approach deals with the accommodation approach, or accommodating. This is where one person typically loses and another person in the conflict wins. So we could see this type of a situation where, let's say, rather than Sam talking with Chris about the problem that he has, or rather than Sam sticking up for his own needs in the relationship, Sam might actually just placate Chris and decide to just give Chris what he wants just to keep him happy in the short term. Now, although accommodating can be an effective strategy to get rid of a conflict in the short term, generally speaking, this is not a very ideal approach to managing conflict because the person who ends up doing the accommodating in the relationship over time will probably end up feeling as if their needs are not being met. They may end up feeling resentful towards the person who ends up getting their needs met, and ultimately that situation can again contribute to unexpressed resentment, unexpressed hostility and problems, and it can overall break down the quality of the relationship. Even if there's an appearance of peace, the actual feelings that people have about the other person in the relationship may not be that favorable, even if they are not in conflict. So these are a couple of approaches, and we're going to go through a few more here in the next few minutes. Another approach to conflict is the competition approach, or the competing approach. Oftentimes, this approach will contribute to a win-lose situation where one person gets their needs met and the other person does not, or a lose-lose situation where both people do not end up getting their needs met. So, for example, rather than working on finding a location to go on vacation in a relationship, like let's say there's a family situation and maybe one person in the relationship wants to go to Mexico for vacation and maybe another person wants to go to Tahiti for their vacation, right? Rather than seeking to find a third alternative that would make both people happy, the person who has the money, or perhaps the person who is paying for the vacation, may decide that they are going to use their financial resources to control, and they may say something like, well, if you don't give in and go where I want to go, then we just won't go on vacation at all. All right? So as you can tell, this is not an ideal approach to managing conflict. It is a situation, again, that although one person's needs may be met in the short term, the overall effect of that type of a strategy on the relationship in the long term is detrimental and will not affect the relationship in a favorable way. It's important to acknowledge in the competing conflict approach that the style of communication that can sometimes play out between people is passive-aggressive communication. Passive-aggressive communication is different than aggressive communication because it is not directly aggressive, but instead it is aggressive in a more covert way where you convey the same sentiments to people, but you just don't do it directly to their face. So somebody who tends to be passive-aggressive may engage in dismissive behavior, ignoring behavior. They may make mean jokes or comments to you, and then they might say something like, "Oh, I was only joking," or they might say something that's like a mean or snide comment in front of people to try to embarrass you in front of other people. They may be chronically late. There's lots of other ways that people may engage in passive-aggressive behavior. But I have to say that passive-aggressive behavior is very damaging in relationships. And if you find yourself on the receiving end of passive-aggressive behavior, you probably already know that it really does not feel good and it is very destructive to the health of the relationship. So if you yourself are on the receiving end of passive-aggressive behavior, I encourage you to think about addressing the behavior with the person who is delivering this kind of communication. If they are not open to modifying their behavior, I encourage you to consider what the costs and the benefits of the relationship are and whether it's a relationship that you want to continue. The research on passive-aggressive communication has found that it is almost as damaging, if not more damaging, than direct, blatant, aggressive communication. And part of the reason for that is because it leaves people wondering if it's just in their head or if they're actually being mistreated. And so it's really a type of manipulative, aggressive strategy where people who are delivering passive-aggressive communication, they don't actually want to own up to their aggressiveness, but it's a way of being aggressive towards someone without actually being very blatant about it. So I strongly discourage using passive-aggressive communication. And if you are on the receiving end of this, I strongly encourage you to take actions to remediate that behavior. Related to the competing approach is direct aggression. Direct aggression may play out in the form of yelling, swearing, hitting, fighting, throwing things like throwing dishes, or hurting animals or children that are close to another person. These are very highly aggressive behaviors. And obviously, this behavior is very destructive. It's very important to mention that if you are in a relationship where you are dealing with direct aggression and or passive aggression, I strongly encourage you to consider seeking counseling. You get free counseling at the university if you are a student, and it would be very useful for you to get into some counseling if you are in a relationship where passive aggressive or direct aggressive behavior is the norm. Because a counselor who's trained in these kinds of issues and in relationships will be able to help you understand the situation objectively. They will also be able to help you figure out an appropriate way of coping with the situation. And if it does not improve, they can help you figure out a way to distance yourself from the person who is the perpetrator of passive aggressive or direct aggression. It is also important to mention at this point that domestic abuse and domestic violence aligns very well with the passive aggressive and direct aggressive style. And people who are aggressive or physically abusive in close relationships tend to get worse over time. They do not tend to get better. The typical strategy of someone who is an abuser in relationships is that they oftentimes start out as very kind and fun and loving and affirming. And then over time, they tend to isolate people from their family or their friends or the people who love them. And then once the person has isolated you from your family and friends and the people that genuinely care for you, then they start to dole out or deliver many of these aggressive types of behaviors. And so the profile of someone who is being battered by a domestic abuser is oftentimes something that follows that course or that process. And it's very important if you find yourself ever in a situation where you are being mistreated by someone in these ways, that you seek help, and that you seek help from a trained professional counselor, and alternatives to violence of the police or alternatives to violence in the city in which you're living is a great option for getting some help with how to deal with these kinds of situations. People who are physically aggressive in relationships do not improve over time unless they seek professional help. The research shows that people who are physically abusive have often been abused themselves as children, or have seen their own parents be abusive to each other. And so the reason that they think it's normal or acceptable is because it's what they grew up watching. So it's very important to take this kind of a situation very seriously, because it's a very serious situation. And obviously, if you are in a relationship where you are experiencing this kind of communication, it is not likely to ever get better without any kind of professional intervention. Another conflict style that is more optimum than the other types that we've discussed is compromising. Compromising includes situations where both people give up a little bit, but they are both able to gain a little bit as well. So, for example, let's say you're having a conflict with one of your roommates about who gets to watch the big screen TV, and you both want to be watching it on the weekends and also on the weeknights. And so maybe rather than having the conflict go on or having to deal with this conflict every evening when your shows come on, you just decide it's worth it to say to them, okay, you can choose the TV shows that we watch during the week, but I get to choose what we watch on Saturday and Sunday. So that would be an example of compromising, where both people lose a little bit, but at the same time, both people also get a little bit of what they want. One of the drawbacks with compromising behavior in terms of a conflict management approach is that people tend to be less invested in the outcome when there's a compromise that's taken place because of the fact that they had to give up something. So there's a possibility for people not to be very committed to the actual resolution that you come up with. So with compromising strategies, you want to make sure that you are checking in with people after the conflict has been resolved over time to see, how is this working for you? Do you feel like this is something you still want to continue to do, or should we try to deal with this issue in a different way? And then that way you can try to alleviate some of the lack of commitment issues that can play out in compromising conflict situations. A final case of conflict resolution is the collaboration style. The collaboration style indicates that both people are winning in the outcome, because collaboration truly realizes or truly identifies what the needs are in the other person and what your needs are, and it allows both people in the conflict situation to have their needs met generally 100%. Now, this may not always be 100%, but ideally, shooting for a collaboration approach is really the ideal, because people are more invested in the outcome when it's over. They will be more emotionally satisfied with the situation. Now, one of the drawbacks with the collaboration style of conflict resolution is that it can take a lot longer to resolve things than, let's say, compromising or just accommodating. However, in terms of relational quality, the collaboration method is much more optimum for a more positive relationship experience and for the relational quality, because both people's needs and thoughts and feelings are being met and acknowledged and addressed. And so as a result of that, they are more committed to the relationship and they feel happier in the relationship over time. So an example of collaborating with the above situation of television would be that you could say, okay, well, you know, if you want to watch TV on the weekend, I can watch the TV during the week, and then you can watch online shows on the weekend and I get the TV during the weekend. So this way, there's a way of potentially having all the needs met. Another option would be that you could offer to record shows during the week so that you don't actually miss any shows, that you could let your roommate watch the TV during the week, but you could have an understanding that you're going to be pre-recording the shows that you want to watch later, and then that way you really wouldn't be losing out or missing those shows because you'd still get to watch them. So the collaboration style is the most optimum conflict resolution approach. It does take a lot longer to achieve it, but in terms of relational quality, it really is the gold standard. Another thing worth considering when talking about conflict and interpersonal relationships are the conflict styles that people have when they approach conflict. So we talked about different types of approaches to managing conflict. We talked about people who avoid conflict. We talked about people who are accommodating, that give in. We talked about people who are more dominating or competitive with their conflict style. So when we talk about the kinds of approaches, we can look at approaches that would be complementary, right? And this would include people who have different types of behaviors that they bring to a conflict situation. So for example, sometimes what you'll find in relationships is that one person, let's say a romantic relationship, okay? Sometimes what you find is that one person in the relationship tends to be more assertive than the other person who may be more avoidant in the relationship. So although complementary aspects to individual personalities can actually be an asset in long-term relationships, these different types of approaches to dealing with conflict can cause some challenges, right? So imagine a situation where you have been raised and socialized to deal with conflict in an assertive way, not necessarily in a competitive or dominating way, but in an assertive way where you're honest and you're upfront with your feelings and you're upfront about asking for your needs to be met, right? Let's say you're in a relationship with someone who has been taught in their family system to avoid conflict at all costs, right? That can contribute to some difficult situations for you because one person thinks that the conflict should be dealt with in a very upfront manner. The other person perceives that the conflict should be dealt with in an avoidant manner or not dealt with at all. And this can cause problems in relationships long term. So what I always suggest for people, especially in romantic relationships, is that you discuss conflict approach strategies ideally prior to having a conflict. So you can ask people questions that will allow you to understand what kind of approach they were socialized with early on in the getting to know you phase. You can ask them questions about their family systems. You can ask them questions about the relationship that they have with their parents or with their siblings. You can ask them questions about the way that their parents dealt with conflict when there was a conflict in the home. You can ask them what they think about the way that the conflicts were dealt with. You know, these are all ways that you can get a sense of how people will be when they deal with conflict. The other thing you can do is observe them in terms of how they deal with other people in conflicts, because chances are there will be some similarities in how they deal with conflicts across the board. So it's good to be aware of the fact that these complementary differences, although they can be an asset to relationships in terms of personal disposition or like wants and things like that, sometimes with conflict, these complementary approaches can be challenging. So you do need to identify this and address this ideally early on in the relationship so that you don't have issues. In addition, I talked about this earlier, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of taking a time out in any kind of conflict situation where one or more people are becoming upset, sad, irritated, frustrated, or any of those types of behaviors. It's very important to attempt to circumvent the fight or flight response that tends to be activated when the amygdala region of the brain becomes stimulated. And so when you allow yourself to take some time to calm down, you're able to let the amygdala region of the brain calm down, which will deactivate the stress-producing hormones of cortisol. It will also reduce the amount of adrenaline going through your body, and this process allows you to think more clearly. It allows you to rationally process information, and it allows you to respond to people in a more clear, rational way. Another thing to consider with conflict is the fact that you may have a different conflict style depending on what the issue is. So for example, perhaps with your family, or perhaps in dealing with your family issues in terms, let's say you're in a romantic relationship again, and perhaps you have been taught by your family to be assertive, and that maybe you have had to set some boundaries with your own family with regards to your romantic relationship, right? So things like where you go for holidays, things like how much time do we spend with our family and how much time do we spend on our own, right? So you may be accustomed to being assertive with your family in terms of the communication aspect of the relationship, But it may also be the case that in your family system, even though people were pretty assertive about day-to-day stuff, that maybe people did not talk about money because money was a source of stress, or maybe money was a source of anxiety for people in the family. And so maybe it's possible that you may have both the assertive and the avoidant approach that is being delivered or used depending on the actual conflict situation that you're in. So it's very worth developing a good self-monitoring approach where you're able to identify what behaviors you are engaging in, ideally when you're engaging those behaviors, or at the very least, try to develop self-monitoring after the fact so you can understand what you did, where it aligns in terms of these different behaviors that we're learning about in this class, and why you did those things. Because with that kind of knowledge, you are able to then make a choice about what you want to do in the future, right? So obviously we know that avoidant behavior is really not an effective way to deal with things, but if you have been taught to avoid talking about financial issues, that is something you will probably do. But if you become aware of that, then you can circumvent it and you can work to be more assertive about it in the future. Another thing to think about is the fact that there may be symmetrical conflict styles. And this is the case, for instance, when you end up in a romantic relationship, or if you can think of it as a friendship situation as well, where people have the same type of conflict approach. So let's say you are in a relationship with someone and you both have been taught to avoid conflict, right? Well, that would be a good example of symmetrical conflict styles. Another example would be a situation where both of you have been taught to use collaboration, right? You're both using the same type of approach. Now, collaboration is ideally the most effective approach to dealing with conflict. However, an interesting finding about avoidance in relationships, especially long-term romantic relationships, is that the research actually shows that if both parties in a marriage are highly avoidant of conflict, the relationship actually can have a fair amount of stability and satisfaction because both people just don't acknowledge conflict, and so then they don't get into fights about stuff because they're constantly stepping around it. And so what that means is that there is a much lower level of negative affect that they end up expressing to each other in comparison to people, let's say, who both have an assertive style or people who both have a competitive style or something like that. So I am not endorsing avoidance in relationships. However, the main idea to think about here is that the style of conflict that you have will influence the way in which the conflict plays out, as well as the style of conflict that the other person has. So obviously, as we know, it takes two to tango, right? It takes two to engage in a conflict. So rather than seeing the situation as one of, oh, well, you know, I'm always trying to be nice and this person is being assertive and critical, you know, maybe they just are socialized to be more assertive and you were socialized to be avoidant. And the reality of it is that it takes two people to make a relationship work, right? So if you can acknowledge the fact that you have different strategies for managing conflict, that is a really excellent starting point for trying to figure out a way where you can both adapt your behaviors and meet somewhere in the middle so that you're able to have an effective conflict resolution approach when and if conflicts do come up. When selecting the different types of conflict styles to evoke in certain types of situations, there are several things that you would like to consider. One of these is you want to consider the relationship that you have with someone. Obviously, if you're in a situation where you are working with someone and you have a low status relationship compared to their status in the organization, you definitely want to choose a conflict approach that is going to be more accommodating or collaborative, right? Likewise, if you are in a higher power position at an organization and you're dealing with subordinates, you want to be mindful of the fact that you are in the higher power position and you want to make sure that you don't abuse that power by evoking aggressive or dominating conflict approaches, okay? So we want to deal with these different types of conflicts appropriately and effectively considering the relationship we have. in terms of power levels, also in terms of intimacy, how close you are to someone or not, okay? So you definitely want to think about those things. Another thing to think about is the situation. How important is this situation to you? Is this a situation where you have to resolve this conflict, or is this something that you don't really need to address right now? Maybe it's something that you could just keep your eye on and see if it continues to be an issue. The phrase, pick your battles. Many of us have heard this phrase before, right? Pick your battles. So that phrase basically implies that if we're constantly seeing problems in situations, then, you know, it can be a real challenge, right? So it's really much more effective to reserve your energy, time, and breath to deal with the situations that are important to you. Okay, because that way you're not going to be constantly in a state of conflict with various people because you're always having to deal with issues that are important. So choose the situations that are important and deal with those. And if it's not that important, it might be good just to let it go. Another thing to consider is the other person. What is the other person's intention, perhaps? It's very difficult for us to actually know what people are thinking or intending. The only thing that we can really describe with absolute certainty is what people do, right? Their behaviors. So we want to be careful that we don't assume that people have certain intentions that we don't know about. But we also want to be careful of our own intentions as well, right? If I know, for example, that someone is doing something that may be annoying, but that they have very good intentions towards me, then that information will temper the way that I respond to them, right? So these are all things we want to think about. And finally, we want to think about the goals we have. What are the goals we have for the relationship? And what is the best way to address the conflict so that we can meet those long-term relational goals? Obviously, if you're going to be in a relationship with people for a while, you want to try to deal with conflict in a collaborating way so that you don't alienate people or make them feel unheard or oppressed, right? So we want to think about our goals. And also, do we have goals to help other people? Do we have personal goals that we're trying to achieve in this conflict that maybe are not appropriate? Perhaps we have certain issues that we shouldn't be bringing to the workplace, and perhaps some of these issues are influencing the way that we respond to coworkers, right? You want to be very conscious and mindful and self-reflexive of what you're up to. And this is done and achieved by contemplating who you are, what your goals are, and why you do the things that you do. And it's also important to think about the effect that the conflict styles that you have used in the past have had on the relationships that you have today. If you find that the conflict style you've used in the past is not effective, then clearly you want to work to moderate or minimize using that style in the future. So these are all things that we can consider when choosing a conflict style. Effective conflict resolution requires several things. We're going to go through each of these one by one. The first thing that we need to do is to identify the problem that we're dealing with and what our needs are. So this is where we really need to work to be specific about what the actual issue is and what we need in terms of changing the situation or in terms of another person's behavior in a relationship or what have you. Now, another important part of this aspect of identifying the problems and needs is that it's very important when we discuss conflict issues to isolate the conversation to one topic at a time. You do not want to try to solve, an entire relational set of issues all at once. You want to choose one issue to resolve at once, and then after you have resolved that issue at a future time, then you can go back and resolve another issue at the future time. And this is because otherwise, if you try to do everything at once, it gets very overwhelming and the conflict conversation can spiral out of control. Another thing we want to do once you identify what the problem is and what your needs are is you want to set up a date to talk. So this includes talking to the other person or the other party, trying to figure out a time that works for both of you where you're not going to be feeling pressured, and setting it up in an ideal location where you both feel that you have the space you need to talk comfortably about the issue. So sometimes that means at someone's home, other times that might mean at a coffee shop, or maybe some people like to talk and walk. That's another thing that some folks can do. But it is always good to set up a date to talk rather than trying to just dump the issue on someone when you feel like it, because this way a person has time to prepare their own thoughts and their own needs, and they have time to set aside time so that they can dedicate a certain amount of time to actually resolving the issue, so they don't feel pressured about other things when you are attempting to resolve the issue. Now, once you actually do get into the conversation with the person, it's very important that you use non-defensive, provoking communication to describe your needs, describe what the problem is, what your needs are, what you need to change, okay, what you're willing to work on in terms of your own change, because as we know, we cannot expect that the other person is going to change in the relationship and that we will not change at all. So ideally, you need to have an attitude of being willing to work together and to compromise to come up with a situation where both people or both parties feel that their needs are being met. Now, sometimes this can take a little bit longer to achieve that, because as we talked about, it does take a little longer to disclose and to work through conflict in a way where both people feel that their needs are truly being met and addressed. However, it is worth it if you are able to adapt to that style, because in the long run, people will be more committed to the actual resolution, and so they will be happier with the situation, and then they will also be probably happier with the relationship as well. And so when we are describing the problem or sharing what our needs are, this is where we really want to work on using I statements rather than you statements. We want to work on describing concrete behaviors rather than making blanket conclusive statements about other people in terms of character traits, right? So you want to describe specific behaviors rather than giving people insults about what a terrible person they are or what have you. This is where we want to work on perception checking. So when somebody else is describing to us what the issue is in their perspective, we want to paraphrase what we've heard so that we can work to understand them effectively. Going along with understanding another person effectively is having a genuine willingness to understand and consider your partner's view. Now, sometimes this is difficult because we might think that our perspective is the right perspective, right? However, we need to really remember that in any kind of conversation or relationship or interaction, there are actually three perspectives, right? There is person A's perspective, there is person B's perspective, and then there is the actual situation in terms of an objective scenario of what's actually playing out, right? And so person A may not see what person B sees, but person B might see something that person A doesn't see. And then you have a whole other perspective, which is the actual concrete objective situation, right? So we always want to be open to considering our partner's viewpoint. And in fact, when both people win in a conflict, then the relationship wins, right? So we want to think about that you may, if you feel like your perspective is right, then that's okay. However, just because your perspective is right for you does not mean that your partner's perspective is wrong, okay? It's possible to have two viewpoints that are not the same, that are both correct. And so this goes into the idea of being open and being willing to consider other alternative viewpoints. And this is a very important part of effective communication and effective relationships. So it's definitely worth considering that. At some point in the conversation, you are going to want to negotiate a solution, and the solution may deal with resource issues. So how are we going to allocate resources to alleviate or deal with this issue? The solution may also deal with behavioral negotiations. So how are we going to change or modify our behaviors so that we both are getting our needs met better? The solution may also include setting boundaries. So sometimes people have to work to set boundaries with family members or coworkers, or maybe even in a relationship, you may need to set a boundary with your partner in terms of maybe you need to have a certain amount of personal space every day in order to feel okay with the way things are going. And if that's something that you need, then that's a boundary, or that's something you're going to have to ask for, because that is unique to the person, right? Like, so if you decide after getting to know yourself throughout this course that you are someone who needs to have an hour alone at the end of the day just to decompress and unwind, then that's something that you would want to articulate to the people in your life that are around you on a day-to-day basis, so that they can work to accommodate that need. And this would go into negotiating a solution for how we deal with each other, okay? So these are all important aspects of conflict resolution. Finally, once you do negotiate a solution, it's always important to check in several days or several weeks after the initial solution has been established so that you can follow up and see, is this working? Are we both feeling satisfied with the solution that we came up with? Is it not working? Are there other things that we haven't thought about that we need to deal with? And if so, how do we go ahead and deal with those things? The benefits of forgiveness in terms of conflict resolution and effective relationships cannot be emphasized enough. The research has shown that forgiveness of the self, forgiveness of other people, has tremendous health benefits in terms of physical health, mental health, and emotional health. Now, forgiveness is something that we talk about a lot, right? We might hear about it a lot, especially in terms of, religious teachings about the way that we should respond when people behave in ways that are not ideal, right? However, more recent research has really been emphasizing the ways in which forgiveness helps our own health. And the research shows that you don't even have to forgive someone who wants your forgiveness, or the person that you're forgiving doesn't even have to be sorry for what they did in order for you personally to experience the health, mental health, and emotional health benefits of forgiveness. So forgiveness is something that in some cases you have to choose to do every single day. Sometimes you might be choosing to forgive someone every hour or every minute. However, if possible, it is really worth working on adopting a practice of forgiveness whenever people do things that you perceive are wrong or perhaps not fair or an injustice to you. Now, we can look at forgiveness in terms of forgiving small little transgressions, so little snide comments perhaps, or maybe people who forget to, do their chore like they said they were going to. And you can also look at forgiveness in terms of very large issues or very large transgressions, right? Such as things in relationships or, things in family systems where people have to really work on forgiving in order to move forward in the relationship. And even if you decide that you are not going to continue a relationship with someone, or that you want to establish more distance with the person as a result of their behaviors in the relationship, it is still very wise to work on cultivating the skill of forgiveness for your own benefit and for your own health and long-term vitality. So, as we wrap up this course, I just would like to thank you all for being a great class. I've enjoyed my interactions with you, and I've enjoyed lecturing on many of these interpersonal communication principles and topics. I wish you all the very best in your future journeys, and I hope that this course has contributed to your understanding of yourself in terms of the way you are and why you are the way you are. And I hope that the course has also contributed to some understanding about other people and ways that we can bridge the differences and come together so that we can have effective relationships with the people that we care about. Have a wonderful rest of the semester, and I wish you all the best.